Today we're going to examine the market structure of monopolistic competition. Earlier we had talked about the market models of perfect competition, where there are so many firms that no individual firm or individual buyer for that matter can affect the market price. Then we talked about the market of monopoly, where there's only one firm that is able to charge whatever price it wants, subject to the demand that it's facing. Now, though, what we noted is that neither of those market models are particularly common. Most markets fall somewhere in between. One type of market structure between the extremes of monopoly and perfect competition is monopolistic competition. This is a somewhat more realistic market model in that we see it all over the place, and we'll talk about some examples shortly. The characteristics of a monopolistically competitive market include some ways in which it's similar to competition or perfect competition. Specifically, there are many buyers and sellers, and there's easy entry and exit. So it's fairly easy to start up a monopolistically competitive firm, and there's nothing preventing firms from entering it, which makes it different from a monopoly, where there are some barriers to entry that keep other firms out. It's similar to monopoly, though, in that each firm is essentially a small monopoly producing its own unique product. A good example of monopolistically competitive model would be the restaurant industry in a large city, where there are perhaps thousands or even tens of thousands of individual restaurants, each of which is unique. It's the only firm that has its specific recipes, menu, decor, ambiance, and so forth, but it's competing with thousands of other firms. In New York City, for example, there are hundreds of Italian restaurants and Indian restaurants and Thai restaurants and Greek restaurants and so forth, and each of those essentially is competing in some way with all the others for customers. Let's examine what the implication of these characteristics are. Because each firm is able to differentiate its product from those of other firms, it faces a downward sloping demand curve. There are some people who really like a particular restaurant's menus and recipes more than others, and if the firm chose to raise its prices, those customers would stay. Some others perhaps will leave to other places, but what happens is that to the extent to which a firm is able to differentiate its product, it's able to raise prices without losing many customers. Alternatively, if it lowers its prices, it will pick up some customers, but not all customers, because individuals have preferences over which particular mix of characteristics they like. Now, because the demand curve is downward sloping, as we noted earlier, the marginal revenue curve lies below it. In particular, since a firm has to lower its price to sell more output, the marginal revenue from an extra unit is less than the price, because it has to lower the price not just for the last unit it sells, but for all units. And as a result, when a firm is thinking about trying to sell more, it has to take into account the impact of the lower price, not just on one more unit, but the impact of lowering its price on all of the units. Now, because entry is possible, though, we have to think about what happens as firms enter or leave a monopolistically competitive market. In this diagram, I've illustrated the effect of new firms entering the market. If there are now suddenly an increase, for example, in Thai restaurants in New York City, because they have been more profitable, for example, now customers will have more choices. And if there are more choices for people, they're going to use those choices. So when the number of firms goes up, the customer base gets spread out among a larger number of Thai restaurants, for example. And what that will mean basically is that each firm will have fewer customers at any given price. So the demand curve facing a typical firm will go down. Demand will fall when there are more choices for customers. In addition to that, we can note that when customers face more choices, demand tends to become more elastic. So an increase in the number of firms will both reduce the demand facing a typical firm and cause demand to be more elastic at any given price. That's illustrated in this diagram by the shift from the demand curve D to D prime. Now, let's consider a short-run equilibrium for a typical firm in a monopolistically competitive industry. The optimal level of output, the profit-maximizing or loss-minimizing level of output, as we've talked about before, will occur at the level of output where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Here we see that occurs at an output level of Q sub MC. The price which is charged, as in the case of a monopoly industry, as in the case of all industries, is given by the demand curve at that level of output. And in this case, we see the price would be P0. because the price is above average total cost, that means that a typical firm is making economic profit. If this had been a pure monopoly, the story would stop there, and this would persist into the long run. But in a monopolistically competitive industry, these profits will signal other firms that they should enter this market. And since there's no barriers to entry, new firms will enter the market. And as we just noted, the increase in the number of firms will reduce demand and cause demand to become more elastic. And that process will continue until the profits disappear. Because notice, as demand lowers, the price is going to fall and the profits received by a typical firm will decrease. In the long run, though, we'll end up with a zero profit equilibrium, just as in the case of perfect competition. And we can see that here. At this point, economic profits are zero because the price is just equal to average total cost at the level of output where profits are maximized, where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. We refer to this as a tangency equilibrium because the demand curve and average total cost curves are tangent right at this point. This diagram should look familiar because we saw this identical diagram in the case of a zero profit monopolist, for example, a monopoly that's resold in a market where there is perfect information. So in a long-run equilibrium, if firms are making economic profits, other firms will copy that, will enter the market until those profits disappear. Alternatively, if in the short run there's losses, a firm will produce at the level which is optimal, which for this firm occurs again where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and because the price is above average variable cost, the firm will continue in the short run. But in the long run, firms have the option of having zero losses by leaving the industry. And over time, firms will start leaving, and as they leave, demand will start increasing for the surviving firms. So as that occurs, the price will start rising until eventually firms stop leaving. And they stop leaving when we get back to the zero profit case once again. So what happens basically is if there's profits, new firms enter until the profits disappear. If there's losses, firms leave until the losses disappear. That part of this is very similar to what we saw in perfect competition, but there is an important difference here. The important difference is that in a competitive equilibrium, what happens is the long-run solution occurs at the minimum point on the average total cost curve. As we noted earlier in the discussion of perfect competition, the demand curve facing a typical firm is horizontal at the market equilibrium price and economic profits are zero. That would occur here at a price of P sub PC and a quantity of Q sub PC. A monopolistically competitive firm, though, does not face a horizontal demand curve because the product is not identical. It has a differentiated product, and as a result, it has a downward sloping demand curve, which is tangent. So both perfectly competitive firms and monopolistically competitive firms in the long run are at zero profit equilibria, where their demand curve is tangent to the average total cost curve. But in the special case of perfect competition, it's not just tangent, but it's tangent at the minimum point. Because the demand curve is downward sloping for a monopolistically competitive firm, that always occurs at an output level below the competitive output level and at a higher price. Or they would like to produce more to get lower costs, but it's not optimal to produce more. This phenomena is referred to as excess capacity, that while the demand curve is tangent to the average total cost curve for both a perfectly competitive firm and a monopolistically competitive firm, they occur at different points. This excess capacity means basically that a monopolistically competitive firm would have lower costs if it produces more. We could also note that there is a deadweight loss here because the price is above marginal cost. So society is losing something from this. That's referred to as an efficiency cost of monopolistic competition. On the other hand, the reason why this cost exists is because we have product variety. And essentially, the deadweight loss here that occurs due to monopolistic competition is offset by the fact that we have more choices. If every restaurant served food that was identical to every other restaurant, we'd have lower costs and we'd have more output produced, but perhaps we might not enjoy going out to dinner quite as often. A couple things we can note, though, is that as there are more firms in the market, monopolistically competitive firms becomes more elastic. So the amount of excess capacity, if we think about that, will become a bit smaller. In particular, as the number of firms in a market expands, the market would approach the limiting case of a perfectly competitive market. And as a result, there is less economic inefficiency in monopolistically competitive markets when there's a very large number of firms. Now, in the short run, firms can get profits by reducing the elasticity of demand and by increasing demand. And firms face a strong incentive to try to differentiate the product and to advertise to convince consumers that their product is better. And in the short run, they can gain profit from that. Unfortunately, though, for the individual firm, other firms are free to copy those innovations, and they generally do fairly quickly. And so we see improvements disseminate throughout the whole market, and those profits disappear. But there's continually an incentive for firms to try to innovate to gain some short-run profit. But again, in the long run, those profits disappear as other firms copy those innovations. One thing we noted a bit earlier when we were talking about game theory is that monopolistically competitive firms often locate near each other to try to appeal to the median customer in a geographical region. For example, in the case of fast food restaurants or car dealerships, which if you think about your own communities, you can probably see that they are often clustered in fairly narrow geographic regions.